For 30 years, retirement planning ran on a single number, 4%. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio in year one, adjust for inflation, and historically you'll never run out of money. But the world has changed dramatically since that rule was created. Today, we're asking the question every retiree needs to answer. Is the 4% rule still valid? And if not, what do we use instead? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Capitalist Investor. As always, you have me, Diamond Hands D. I don't think we've been thrown that name out in a while, so good to bring it back as crypto is crashing. But we got two special guests back, better than ever, Sam and Jack. How we doing, guys?
Good. How are you?
Excellent.
Doing well. Wish I had a cool nickname, but
yeah. We'll work on it. Maybe something with like New Orleans, like Cajun flair. I'll come up with something. All right. Well, today we're talking about the 4% rule, which is something we hear about all the time as advisors. So yeah, we'll do a little Q&A here to kind of talk about the 4% rule. How valid it still is, and what we should also be thinking about. So. Jack, I'll start with you. So could you maybe just give a quick kind of overview of what the 4% rule is?
Yeah, it was popularized in like a study in 1994 by William Benjamin. It basically took 50 years of market data with a rolling 30-year retirement period. And it just found that 4% of initial withdrawal adjusted annually for inflation never depleted a balanced portfolio before 30 years. So the key takeaway is Benjamin called it a floor. It was not a target, and most people have misapplied that ever since.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really good point there, because it was never meant to be like the rule to end all rules. So that's a good point there. So Sam, what do you think? You think anything's changed since 1994? 1994, I was dialing up AOL on my 28K modem. Yeah, it was good times back then.
Yeah, it wasn't even a thought then. So yeah, sure, a lot's changed, right? Could look at bond returns for one, right? So rules based on decades of healthy bond returns, what just really isn't the reality anymore at this point. Hasn't really been the case since the 2010s. You also got to think about longevity risk too, right? People are living longer now, so 30-year time horizon post-retirement isn't necessarily worst case scenario anymore for a healthy couple retiring, around age 60. You also got to consider market valuations as well. So we've been seeing a lot of elevated stock prices recently, right? In turn, we can expect lower future returns than Benjamin's historical data has captured. And lastly is inflation too, right? So, obviously we saw a surge from 2021, 2023, but kind of reminded everyone that CPI adjustments are not theoretical. They can materially impact how much a retiree needs to withdraw each year.
All right. Well, I would say probably, inflation of everything you just mentioned there is probably, most front and center on people's minds. And, it's certainly throwing a monkey wrench into the 4% calculation. So yeah, Jack, what do you think? Do you think it's, do you think is the 4% rule something we can still kind of use, or do you think it's something we need to completely throw out and come up with something different?
Well, it seems like there's kind of like differing points of views on it. You have like Morningstar on one hand saying that you could probably revise it down to 3.3%. That may be more appropriate given the current market conditions. You still have the Kitse's counter argument that says 4% still remains reasonable for true 30-year retirements, but it gets a bit hairy when you enter longer time horizons for retirement. So the bottom line, I think it depends on retirement length. It depends on a person-to-person basis. There's not a cookie-cutter 4% anymore that fits all people. So I guess it can change a bit.
Yeah, I think you hit on a couple good points there. But when I'm sitting down with my clients, I think spending flexibility is kind of usually at the top of their list for something that's important to them. So most of my clients aren't looking to do like the bare minimum just to eke by, right? So I think it's a good thing to talk about just because so many people know about it. So many people have heard of the 4% rule. But I think in actuality, it's really just kind of a, quick reality check. Maybe if you're like approaching retirement, right? And you can kind of use that as a guide to figure out, high level where you are. But, some alternatives that we can look at as a potential replacement or, addition to the 4% rule. Just a couple things. We got the guardrail approach. So you kind of, set and define your upper and lower limits, which I use a lot with my clients. When we're working on their financial plan, I would say like a max spend scenario is something a lot of people ask for. So, what that is, say your budget is $80,000 a year. But based on your retirement savings and your overall plan, like how much more could you spend per year and still be okay? And when we say okay, we usually are looking at a 80% Monte Carlo score. So Monte Carlo is, basically probability of success. So run 1,000 trials and make sure we still have money left at the end of the plan. So the guardrail approach or figuring out what your max spend is and kind of going from there. And I would say the second one on my list here, variable withdrawal percentage. I would say a lot of my clients are actually using that, because the market has done so well for the last 3 years, really. Right. It's made a lot of, maybe borderline plans look really good. And it's made a lot of good plans, even better. So we harp on it pretty much every week that might not last forever. So we got to be careful with that. But I'd say, when we've had such a good market run, that does increase people's flexibility. And, this is one we also use quite a bit in planning, kind of income flooring. So like what is... And this is how we do the financial plans. How are we looking, what are the base expenses that we can't live without? So obviously, food, utilities, gas, all the basics, and set that as the floor, and kind of work from there, adding things on top. So because people have different goals, right? They have different things they want to accomplish in retirement. Some people are going to, travel all over the place for the first 5 years. And some people, might stick closer to home. Maybe their families around Northeast Ohio or wherever they're at. So important things to think about there.
What about annuities? How do they fit into this 4% take rate? Do they have any place here?
Well, I feel when I first got into the industry, like annuities were a very hot and contentious topic. I don't know how you guys have encountered this, but I think that it's been so long since 2008 when they really got kind of dragged through the mud, as they say. When you guys are in client meetings and talking with people, do you see a lot of pushback when the word annuity is mentioned?
Not a whole lot anymore. Previously when I was working with Key Bank and their Key Investment Services department, a lot of people that we kind of sat down with, they may have had bad experience with annuities in the past. Right. But I think a lot of it is just kind of the lack of understanding, right? Maybe they worked with an advisor who was pushing a product, try to get a quick commission. When in all reality, the client didn't really know what they were getting themselves into, right? There's like, oh, what do you mean I can't touch my money for the next 10 years, right?
Right.
So,
yep. So, that's how I'll start with annuities. It's there were bad products back in 2005, 6, 7, 8 time period, and a lot of those were variable annuities, something that there's really no reason to get into. There's no reason for you to get your money into them, not to discuss them. But yeah, there's a lot of good products out there now, especially with the increases in inflation and interest rates. They're very attractive products on both the future income side, and then also just the kind of the growth side. Just to throw out some numbers, you can get into an annuity now that'll pay you a cap rate of up to, we've seen 10%. They're between 9 and 10% right now. Cap rate to the S&P 500. Maybe we're getting a little too technical on this one, but that's a big number compared to what they used to be when interest rates were 0%. So those annuities, carry very little risk. Obviously, there's no such thing as a risk-free investment. But then they usually have a 10% withdrawal feature. If you're not using the income ones, you're using the growth. And my clients are using that 10% free withdrawal on those growth annuities as an income base, which is something that financial plans really like, because we know that it's not going to fluctuate in value. It's not going to go down. It's not going to participate in the downside. So annuities are actually a pretty good way to layer in some income, maybe some guaranteed income if you don't have like a pension or things like that. Something definitely worth looking into, because I've been saying it for a long time now. Retirement is income, so building out your income strategy is the most important thing that you can do. Not just just using that 4% number and just saying, hey, I'll be okay. I'll just do this 4%. It'll be fine. So yeah, I do like annuities. Obviously, everyone's situation is different. It might not fit perfectly in everyone's situation, but I'd say it's something we do take a look at for most of our clients. So, let's wrap this one up here. I think probably my key takeaway before we get to these here. Everyone's going to be different, like I said. Make sure you are planning out your retirement and not just using any rules that you might find out there on the internet or things like that. We don't want to put our entire future based on some rule that was created in 1994 that may not even apply to everyone's situation. So yeah, what are your guys kind of takeaways as we wrap up here?
I mean, I think my key takeaway is just that flexibility is worth more than precision. So, modest spending adjustments in bad years can dramatically improve your portfolio survival. I think that's important for a lot of people to remember, that it's not always going to be a linear thing. Some years you're going to have to reel it back a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Derek, to kind of build off your point, I mean, it shouldn't be the end-all, be-all, right? I mean, 4% rule, it's a great starting point, but it's not necessarily a strategy that's fit to handle, over 30 years of withdrawals potentially, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, thanks you guys for joining me this week, talk about the 4% rule. So, I think I'll wrap it up. Just reiterating the point. It's still probably fairly valid, even though it's changed quite a bit over time. But it's really just a starting point, like we've been saying. Make sure you're using a financial plan to kind of map out your income and how that's going to work for you over your retirement. So thank you for joining us this week. If you guys have any questions or comments, ideas for a show, hit us up at info@swpconnect.com, and we'll talk to you next week.
The opinions expressed in the podcast are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any investment, legal, financial, or tax strategy. It is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. Please consult a qualified professional about your individual needs.